Hello, everyone. I'm Dennis McElroy, president of the ISTE Teacher Education Network, PLN. I want to welcome all of you to the second of the webinar series, Championing Technology Infusion in Teacher Preparation. This series is sponsored by ISTE and the ISTE Teacher Education Network. Just a few logistics. We are going to be recording. It's recording right now and posting these sessions on the ISTE 10 website where you registered for this session. A link to the book chapter being explored today, Systemic Change, will be posted in the webinar chat towards the end of the session. So Lori, why don't you kick things off here?
Melissa, can you, I'll introduce myself first, yes. I'm Lori Guion. I am the coordinator for model schools at BOCES in upstate New York, and also a member of the Teacher Education Network leadership team. And I'm really excited to introduce to you the three speakers that we have today. The first is Rob Muller. He's from the National Louis University. Then we also have Punya Mishra from Arizona State University and Melissa War from Arizona State University as well. So I'll turn it over to the three of you.
Good, thanks.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. So we just have an hour, but we're going to try to cover a few topics and try to get some of your ideas and your thoughts about some of these issues. So in our hour, we're going to talk about a new vision, how technology integration is different from technology infusion, share some experiences about that, provide two action-oriented perspectives, and talk about context-specific solutions. So we're gonna cruise through this and hopefully cover a lot of ground here. Just to start out, for those of you who are new to this idea of technology infusion, we differentiate between technology integration, which is what we do at one point in time, and infusion, which is a whole system and culture around how we help teacher candidates develop technology integration skills. And so that has to do with teaching technology integration, modeling it and practicing it, and making it a core part of what we do in teacher education programs, even into when they are participating in student teaching or other formats in practice, that we can support them in this ongoing act of technology integration. So we have a question we'd like you to answer in the chat. Why is this hard? Why is it hard to, instead of having one course where students learn about technology and educational technology, to move that throughout the whole curriculum? Why is that hard? What are the successes you might have had, and what are some challenges to that? Just go ahead and type in the chat. Let's see what you come up with. And I'll just keep staring at it until someone writes something. Yeah, getting buy-in. And being stuck. So you're working with teachers across a lot of different specialties, and they may or may not be up on new technologies and even just using educational technologies effectively. And so there's a lot of bringing other faculty on board, even when they're not interested. Yeah, and change in general is just hard. And finding agreement in faculty about what to focus on. There's so many different priorities in schools of education. And then a general resistance to change. Buy-in. Yeah, the resources available. Accountability, that's a good one. I like that one, because that is definitely something that once we spread the responsibility for this across a lot of people, who becomes accountable for how to do that. So keep on focusing them, writing them in there. Today, we're going to talk about two different frameworks that can help us start thinking about how to address some of these big challenges we have. So the first one is this 5 spaces for design and education, and Punya is going to talk about this. And then Robert's going to talk about his framework that looks more at a systems view and strategies and theories of change. So we hope both of these areas give you some tools or way to think about how to start this technology infusion process, or how to continue it or face challenges in it. So Punya, I'm just going to say the 5 spaces for design and education is about finding intentional ways to work across different what we call spaces for design make these changes. So Punya, take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you. And thank you, everybody who has joined in here. A couple of things to just say starting out. First, that this 5 spaces framework has been a collaborative effort. Melissa has been a part of it from day one, but there is also a whole group of graduate students who have sort of taken it further under Melissa and other students' leadership. You can find out more about it by going to talkingaboutdesign.com. Melissa, if you can just drop that link, I think you will find a whole series of things around topics of technology integration, design, education, all sort of discussed in that space. So before I start, I want to share a story. This is what we started the chapter with about this car factory, a GM plant I think in California, which was a complete disaster to the point that the workers there were actually breaking the cars. There was drugs on the floor. There was prostitution. You name it. It was just a mess. Within a few years, however, that factory completely transformed and became one of the most successful car factories in the nation, where the workers were incredibly proud of what they were doing. And here's the interesting thing, 85% of the workforce was the same. What had changed was the system, a system which valued their input, a system that gave them agency, a system that supported, gave them pride in their work. And the reason we start with that story is very often when I look at sort of the examples, that all of you have shared, and these are all valid examples of why technology integration is hard, that part of the reason may be that the systems that we have are not conducive to that change. So what's happening, the resistance that we're seeing is because the systems are holding it in place, right? Are holding certain traditional ways of thinking and doing in place. And so, I'm really interested in this idea of design and looking at education as a design field. And so the question is, what is it that we design in education? And I'll come back to the whole technology integration piece once I talk to the 5 spaces. So one thing that is really important to understand that almost every aspect of education is designed. Everything in this is completely and utterly made up. Schools are made up. Certificate programs are made up, classrooms are made up, the structures, the bell schedules, all of this stuff has been made up by people. But when we look at, when we think about what it is that is being designed, so let's take something very simple as a pencil, right? A pencil is, Petrosky has a whole book devoted to the pencil, its evolution, the sort of supply chains that are required to make it reach to be consistent so that you can write well with them. And even the pencil evolved over time. Initially, that it didn't have an eraser, so people would use bread or things like that. And then there's actually a patent for somebody. So there's a whole history around the invention and the making of this artifact. And so and now a pencil plays a critical role in the educational system, right? And it's not just that it plays a role in our taking notes, it's part of educational processes. It is part of the experience that students have, either of completing tests or taking notes. It's part of the culture and system of education right now. And so that brings us to the sort of, when we think about how design is applied to education, that we can see it happening at 5 different levels. And that's what we call the 5 spaces. Actually, levels is not the right word because we don't want to be a hierarchy necessarily there, but there are 5 spaces that we as educators can get in and do things. So the first one is the artifact level. So when we talk about artifact, it could be anything like the examples here show. It could be a computer, it could be actually a chair, it could be the very building that we work in. And if you think about and artifacts are relatively stable objects that can be perceived through the senses, right? And so that's how we define artifacts. And if I look at even my career as working in the field of ed tech, we spend a lot of time designing these artifacts, whether it be textbooks or software or apps or websites. The next level, that an artifact by itself cannot do anything. An artifact has to become a part of a process. So as educators, we are always designing processes, how an app is to be used, how a textbook is to be used, where a desk is to be placed. My friend, Sean Lesher from the Urban School District in San Diego has this lovely blog post about what the meaning of where the teacher's desk is located, conveys. If it's in the front of the table, it conveys one thing. If it is to the side, it conveys something else. And so it is the processes within which these artifacts are embedded that start giving these artifacts meaning and sense. But as educators, we are not just restricted to artifacts and processes. We are also looking at the nature of the student experience. So we are thinking about what the students brings in, what their context is, how they are responding to a certain situation. It's about look and and sights and sounds and feelings and thoughts. So this whole idea of experience design, I think, comes in when we talk about education and learning, and particularly with technology. A bad interface can really put off, whatever. Once I did a calculation of how many clicks it takes to post to a Blackboard forum if you have to start from scratch. Keystrokes, let's say. If you include your login, your password, you click into your class, then once you're in your class, you click into something else, and then you go to the discussion forum, then you go to find the question, then you find the scroll. The total number of clicks would be almost 30 or 40. Imagine if in a regular conversation that we're having, I would have to bend down and touch my toes 40 times before I was allowed to speak. There would be no conversation happening. So it's the nature of that experience that we are also designing. That's a really powerful thing. Now, in our work that I had done previously with my colleague Matt and others around the TPACK framework, if I think about it, the TPACK framework focused on artifacts, the technology, the processes, and the experiences that students would have. I think it was my shift to Arizona State where I got a chance to work with schools and school districts at a scale and in a manner that I had not been able to previously, that led to the sort of the thinking of the design of systems and thinking of the design of culture. And so those are the sort of the two new aspects that sort of we bring into the conversation. So when we think about technology integration, we have to go beyond just thinking of artifacts, processes, and experiences, but start thinking of systems and culture. And I think that's where the technology infusion approach comes in, because the technology infusion approach says that it's not just technology integration, that you can take this thing and just plonk it in the middle of a classroom or a learning context, but rather you're thinking of the interplay of all 5 of these. And these are all spaces that us as educators need to be working in. And so if you think, can we go to the slide number 44? Thank you. And so when you think about technology infusion, we have to start thinking about creating appropriate resources and technologies, setting up the processes for reaching out to teacher educators and to teachers, create experiences. I cannot undervalue this one more than, this is incredibly important, because the nature of the learner experience will determine their persistence at it, their staying with it, their learning from it. And finally, we have to think about broader systems and cultures. If you think about the Carnegie unit is not just a number, it is a whole bag of interrelated components that if you pull one, something else is going to push out. So a lot of the time, the resistance that exists within systems come from these inherited structures that we haven't really thought about. And broadly, it comes down to building a culture in the organization, which is dynamic and gives people agency and voice. One of the things that the grad students in this class that I taught, which ended up becoming the Talking About Design website that I just mentioned, did was they went and interviewed the president of Arizona State University, Michael Crow. And President Crow came to ASU around 18 years ago, and ASU was known as a party school. And he designed a completely different university. And so we were asking him, what does designing a system and a culture mean? And it was fascinating to hear him talk about the kinds of moves he had to make to take ASU from where it was to what it is today. I mean, maybe the single biggest reason I'm at Arizona State is because I heard him speak, and it got me intrigued to come and be here, right? So how do we build this culture? How do we build these systems that allow for this technology infusion to happen? I don't know what I'm doing on time, Melissa. Am I good to have 30 seconds?
You're good.
Okay, thank you. As we worked on this 5 spaces for design and education, 2 things that I had really never paid much attention to, I came to understand as being critical. as educational people involved in educational technology, we often work with technologies and tools. We as educators care about our student experiences. We try to create a culture where our learners are active and engaged and so on. The two things that we don't pay enough attention to, at least I felt that I didn't, are processes and systems. And increasingly, I've come to understand that it is these processes and systems that are the skeleton on which everything else holds. They are not as sexy, they're not as cool, maybe, but they are the skeleton. And I think as educators, so which is why the technology infusion work really involves not much about technology, really. It really is about people, it is about processes, and it's about creating cultures and systems. So I think that, to me, is sort of the power of that framework, and also hopefully got a chance to share with you this line of work that we have been involved in. With that, I will pass it back to Melissa. Melissa, if you want to add, because you've been a part of this from day zero. And I must say, Melissa is going to be graduating soon. That's one of the bittersweet things as a faculty member when you get to work with amazing students and they graduate. So I want to thank her for, publicly here for all the work that she has done on making this framework, talking about design work. It's genuinely a collaboration, and I'm very, very appreciative of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think what I wanted to add about the 5 spaces is it kind of creates a way where you can think about, how do I impact culture? Well, what are the artifacts that we use? What are the documents and things that we put out to our teacher educators? What are the processes that we do to onboard different teacher educators to using technology effectively? And so that's what I really love about the 5 spaces, in addition to what Punya was saying, is it gives you something for designing. It gives you areas to focus on to try to make these broader systems and culture changes. And then I think we're now going to move on to Rob and listen to his ideas about systems change.
Thanks. Thanks, Melissa. I'm gonna babble briefly here, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience, and then go to breakout groups. I think design-based thinking, as you probably gathered from Punya's comment, gives us a really helpful framework to, kind of organize this incredibly complex arena of organizational transformation. And what I'd like to talk a bit about is a slightly different model, very similar, but talk a bit about a different way to approach systems thinking. I'd start with a comment about technology integration versus infusion, and you may find the food analogy a little hackneyed, but integration is sort of like an ice cream sundae, right? You got the chocolate sauce on the ice cream, it works better together, but they also function apart. Infusion is really like a few drops of food coloring in a glass of water, or when you first drop a tea bag into a cup of hot water. Basically, the structure is fundamentally changed and transformed, and you have a inseparable and different entity going forward. Continuing with the food analogies here, I think of this model of organizational change that's on this slide as a pizza. And the idea basically is it's really complicated and really difficult to achieve coherence and alignment in an organization without considering all the slices that really make up organizational performance. This model was developed by the Public Education Leadership Project, which was a partnership between the Graduate School of Education and Harvard Business School. And what they basically posited was this idea that if you think of your strategy or your purpose at the middle, your ability to affect change is really driven by the degree to which you can achieve coherence across all these different pieces of your organization, many of which Punya and Melissa alluded to in their discussion of design. So I'm going to just talk briefly about each of those, starting with, at the center you have your strategic core, and you want to ask yourselves, so are we all on the same page about really what we're trying to achieve here? What is it we are trying to do, not in terms of educational technology or instructional design or something like that, but what are we trying to do in terms of candidate preparation, Have we identified what it means to be an effective and high quality graduate of our programs? Do we know what that looks like? And are we aligned around a strategic vision of teaching and learning that really drives everything that we do? Second piece to look at, Punya alluded to structures, and that we all live, higher education organizations and K-12 organizations are renowned for being incredibly structured and sometimes a bit rigid in their structures. Have we looked at what our structures are and how might they be impeding where we're really trying to go with this technology infusion agenda, and what needs to change? One of the big ideas behind coherence is really looking at where there are disconnects, where, for example, might some way in which your organization is structured or in which the work is structured actually be an explicit impediment to what your goals might be. And you might think of that not only in terms of your individual teacher prep program, but think of it in terms of your College of Education, your larger university context, and also the PK-12 institutions with whom you partner. Thinking carefully about this structural question, I think, is really important if you're going to be successful in putting forward a technology infusion sort of approach. Next slide, please. The next piece of this, and Punya alluded to these as well, are systems and processes. Formal or informal, our work is driven by processes that inform decision making, processes that drive how our organizations behave. Looking at those systems and processes and really considering how do they work and how decisions are affected is another important piece of this puzzle. When we've mapped some of this at the College of Education at National Louis, one of the things we've found is that there are aspects of our processes that are really kind of inimical to what we're trying to do in driving a more technology-infused approach in our teacher prep program. So what that has resulted in is, for example, some changes to our to the way we do our curriculum and program development to make the technology components really explicit up front. So look at your systems and your processes, and you can break them down. I think sometimes we're guilty in education circles of thinking about processes at a very high level. Break them down really into actionable pieces where you can start to map who does what, when, over what time period. Of course, resources are important to this, and that's not just about trying to garner new resources for investment, but looking at the skills and the capacity of your current team and figuring out, do we have the right set of human capital? Are there areas that we need to develop, or are there areas that we need to change? It's probably unlikely, though maybe if we all get some Recovery Act funds, maybe this will change, but it's unlikely that we're going to get a big infusion in teacher prep programs of new resources for this work. So that means we have to leverage and redirect what we currently have, and we have to be smart about weaving things together and looking at where we do currently invest both in human capital and in technology, and look across all our budget items and see, okay, how can we carve out pieces of this that support our technology agenda. Next slide, if you will. Just continuing around the elements that make up a coherent organizational transformation strategy is people and culture, arguably the most important part, right? We're only as strong and effective as are our teams. So thinking about how do we create, really proactive sorts of cultures that are organized around our technology infusion goals is an important thing to think about. Is your program and is your institution risk averse, or are you risk takers? If you have some folks who are engaged in this agenda and are early adopters, how do you privilege some space for them to carry that agenda forward? How can you create ways in which organizations can experiment in pockets and then basically grow support across a larger program? One of the things we've done in our teacher prep programs at NLU is we started, we've been at this for several years, and we started on a very small scale in one program that we thought was particularly interested in adopting more technology driven and more high leverage practice sort of work. And that has over time grown and expanded. And we've really tried to make sure that we have supported our faculty as they've engaged in that work, whether that has been some additional, whether that's been buyout of teaching time, whether that's been support for scholarly work, or provision of professional development. But thinking, actively about culture and human capital, I think is something that we sometimes do not pay enough attention to, and really figuring out ways that we can provide opportunities for folks to learn and to expand and explore this kind of work. It might be within your own organization. It might be looking at an exemplar in another institution that you think is worth studying. Going through this kind of list of major parts of this model, it's interesting compared to the rest of the higher education enterprise. One thing that is unique to colleges of education, I think, is that we live in the higher ed accreditation and assessment world. We also live in the PK-12 governance world, and we have to really understand both, and we answer to a set of constituencies in both areas. So thinking about how do you engage your partners, not sometime down the road, but at the very front end of this work, where you're building partnerships with schools and districts, and you're seeking out, in some cases, you're going to find that your school and district partners are ahead of your higher ed institution in how they're deploying technology and thinking about technology infusion across their institutions. You may be familiar with kind of the analytical, kind of process of network mapping. Really worthwhile exercise to think about, who's connected to whom, who are boundary spanners, and who are people who have feet in multiple constituencies, who are your thought leaders, and how do you build what really has to be a multi-constituent and multi-stakeholder strategy. That's probably one of the biggest challenges of this work, is it really encompasses the entire organization and the entire system, and none of us have the reins of control over what we're trying to change. If you could flip to the next. And then finally, just a quick second on this. Obviously, this is all about technology infusion and different manifestations of digital learning across our organizations. One thing that has been interesting in our institution is trying to, over time, map and look at kind of pockets of early adoption. What we found is we're in an environment where we've really tried to incent creativity and innovation wherever it might happen. The advantage of that is you come up with some really interesting stuff. The disadvantage is sometimes it's really hard to explain what's going on across the organization. As we've looked around our multiple programs and across faculty and students and our multiple partnerships, we have found lots of examples of this work that have been pretty different. And what we've tried to do is figure out ways to share, instead of a top-down approach where thou shalt do X or Y. We've really tried to shine the spotlight on programs, individual faculty, particular classes, examples that we think have been really notable. And in particular during the pandemic, that's been interesting because we've had to move an entire operation to remote learning, including all our practicum field experience and all that. And there's been just an enormous amount of creativity and information sharing as folks have engaged in that work. So those pieces, structures, processes, stakeholders, culture, and resources are the things to keep in mind. Thank you, Melissa. I was forgetting one of my buckets. Those are the things to kind of keep in mind as you think about this work. But don't worry about doing it all at the same time. You don't want your head to blow up with the complexity. This is a lot of stuff to keep track of. You know, a couple quick tips that I'll leave you with. One is this idea of what you see depends on where you sit. And I think that is particularly true in organizations as complex as ours, is that you're working with folks who have different vocabulary, different roles, and different sort of foci when they're thinking about these kind of issues. So focusing on some common language and shared purpose, where you're getting folks in different parts of your organizations who don't necessarily always work together and don't have the same, you know, organizational goals, working together around a shared purpose, I think is really important. And if you think about this, what you see depends on where you sit idea, you know, literally, it'll become pretty clear to you that folks' perspective on these issues are very, very different. A second kind of corollary here is, you know, be super comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. You know, we're in organizations that have grown up solving technical problems mostly. You know, a technical problem is something you collect the data, you got the right folks, you know how to do it, and you can fix it. These are adaptive problems. You can keep collecting more information, but the only way we're going to get there is by getting a diverse set of thinkers in the room and proceeding, you know, in an incremental way. And with that comes a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty, which sometimes we're just not, you know, comfortable with or used to in the organizations in which we, you know, spend our work lives. Third point ties back to the stakeholder idea. You know, look for allies, build networks, and find examples. The more examples you can find from other institutions or your own institutions of how folks have approached these kind of problems, those are great ways to communicate what you're trying to do. In parentheses there, I note, look for boundary spanners. Those are people who maybe have a foot in an academic program and in your Office of Information Technology, or, you know, who have, you know, teach in one area and do supervision in another, something like that. But look for people who cut across some of the traditional organizational silos in our colleges and universities. I believe it was Punya, or I guess in the chat at the very beginning, someone asked about or mentioned accountability as a, you know, problem. If everybody is responsible for it, no one's responsible for it. I think it is important to, while you're thinking about and trying to engage folks across your institutions, it's got to be kind of clear who's supposed to do what when, and looking for accountabilities so there is some clarity around roles and responsibilities as you know, drill down on this work is important, and, you know, I think sometimes elusive and impedes us moving forward. And then the last piece, the last thought I would leave you with is, you know, chunk it. I'm a big fan of literally writing down an implementation plan and trying to break things down into phases and sequence activities so that you have a good internal sense of what you're trying to do when. This work, I think, is hugely complex. There are many facets to it, and there's a lot that one could potentially engage in at the same time. It'll all happen, and it just isn't all going to happen, you know, right now. So thinking about what has to happen when and what the sequence of activities are, I think is a final kind of observation about kind of this, you know, adopting really a systems way of thinking about infusing technology across our programs. And then in closing, I would just say, if you forgot everything I just said, the most important thing to remember is that this is about teaching and learning. It's not about the technology. It's not about the tool. It's about how are we supporting the ways in which our candidates become excellent teachers. And if we keep that as our North Star, then we're going to do the right thing. And with that, I guess I'll turn it back to Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have just a couple minutes. If you have any questions you'd like to ask anyone here, you can go ahead and type them into the chat. I think maybe for about 5 minutes or so we can do that. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms and explore some more ideas. I'm just looking at my co-presenters to see if that's a good plan here. Okay. So go ahead, if you have any questions, you can type them in. Where to start?
Well, it's Alice in the Wonderland. Start at the beginning, go till the end, and then stop, or something like that, right?
So for me, like I mentioned this earlier with the 5 spaces, when I see like an issue within like our teachers college or something where I'm a student representative, I try to think through, what's happening across these 5 spaces. So, if we're creating a form for something, that's kind of like an artifact that represents a process. What does that form communicate? And is it aligning to the main goals of the culture that we want to create? And just keeping in mind that that's an area that we could maybe hone in on and focus to kind of start shifting things just a little bit. Or when we're creating some meeting or something to bring people together and talk about things, to think about what the experience of that meeting is going to be like. What do we want them to feel and experience to help them get on board for this technology infusion agenda? That's how I kind of try to break things down a little bit. Any other responses to that?
Yeah, so you start at 32. No, I'm only kidding. I think the answer to the question is to ask yourself, what is it you're trying to achieve? And where you start is going to be a function of what it is you're trying to do. So if what you're trying to do is, gosh, I want to look at technology and infusion from the perspective of clinical experience, could be an example. Or maybe I'm looking at this curricularly, or kind of depends on who you are and what your locus of attention is. So I would start with, well, what is it you're trying to accomplish? And then you're probably familiar with the 5 whys. And then I would say why, and answer that question. And then I would say why again. And I would really try and dig in to get to kind of a root cause there. So I don't know if that's a helpful.
No, Robert, thank you for bringing up the 5 whys, because I think that's sort of exactly what I was going to say, which is kind of funny that we are sort of in the same space with that. I think what the systems view has allowed me is to realize that a lot of the friction that we see whenever we try to make change, I don't know if we got to this idea of the fundamental attribution error that we have in psychology, which is that, when I fail at something, it is because of the context. When others fail at something, it's because of something that's inherently wrong with them. And so this fundamental attribution error really gets in the way. And because when we see it from our perspective, we understand the array of situations and pressures and forces that force us to act in one way or the other. And I think that what that has allowed me to do is to always look at, whenever I see change not happening or resistance, is to say what systemic factors are there. Because at the end of the day, it starts with an assumption that everybody wants to do the right thing. We are all here because we care about our students, because we care about the learners, because we care. And then if that is the case, why is there friction and or tension and so on? And it comes down to, there are certain systemic things that are positioning us in certain ways that that may be hidden to us. And I think that's where I think asking those 5 whys becomes very important, but also like sort of what Melissa said, like, I think the example that Melissa and I were talking about the other day is, graduate students not feeling connected. So it's like, okay, let's have another get together, as if we don't have enough Zoom meetings anyway. So the systemic structure, which students feel powerless, their voice is not heard, they don't have a sense of agency, that's the underlying thing. It's not going to be solved by having another coffee or, whatever get together. And so understanding why. And I think this is, again, I think goes back to sort of the idea of design, that you're always respecting the person with whom you're working, because they are coming at it from their point of view, and which is based on experience, on thought, and so on. If they're being resistant, it's not because they're just trying to be resistant. And I think that's sort of really important. I also want to address this question that Arlene asked about the instructional design processes seem so structured, and that's something that I completely agree. And so one of the things that Melissa and I and the rest of my team here, we have a design initiatives team within the college that I lead, is that we do not adhere to any particular model of design, because our understanding and our study of design and designers show that there are many, many ways of doing this. And for instance, an example that I would give would be, the standard Stanford design model always is empathy as being the first step. What we have found in working with teachers, that actually doesn't work very well, because it sort of implies that maybe you don't have empathy, when most teachers have gobs of it. I mean, they are in education because of that. And so moving that piece later actually makes the whole, not that we don't need to have that, but we don't make it the first thing. The first thing may be acknowledging their expertise, their experience, and validating that, and then starting from there. So so we have a very eclectic approach towards thinking about design. We will pick and choose, depending on the context and the situation, what design methods or tools or strategies we would use. And I think one of the problems I feel, and Melissa and I have a paper coming up, presentation coming up at the site conference, which is the title of it, which is Why Design Thinking Sucks in Education. And this is partly an amalgamation of our experiences. And then we are being half facetious and also a little provocative in saying that. But part of the argument is that these standardized models don't fit. And that as educators, as designers of education, we need to be much more eclectic in our ways of approaching these problems.
And I think that goes to that ambiguity that Rob was talking about, being comfortable with the ambiguity and uncertainty, because this doesn't follow a given process. You have to be willing to try things out that you think will work, and then be aware to what does and what does not work, because it's going to work different in different contexts. And that's kind of what design brings that other ways of thinking might not as much, is really specific to your university or your teacher's college or the specific people and time you're working with. And so you have to be willing to make those adjustments and really tolerate that ambiguity. Rob, do you want anything to add?
I just wanted to pick up on one of the well, maybe one or two of the comments in the chat. And in particular, the one, can this type of change be grassroots? Which is such a loaded question, because on the one hand, one of the motivations behind thinking systems is to get away from this idea that it's the teacher's problem. Teacher, go fix yourself. Wrong answer. Fix the system in which the teacher, is working, and then, so that you can, really have an environment that supports, instructional excellence. I think the answer to the bottom up question is, it's really a both and. We know that change that is dictated and prescribed from the top fails, right? I mean, how many institutions have you seen where a leader has come in, pronounced the new initiatives, stuck around for 3 years, left in places the same? At the same time, it is very hard, I think, if one is part of a movement or an idea that is totally in conflict with the prevailing culture or leadership. That's a hard place to be without a bunch of allies. It's lonely, it's tough, and it's isolating. So I think part of my suggestion would be, first of all, if you're totally alone in an institution that's totally not supportive, maybe find another a different place, but find peers, find like-minded folks, and find people with whom together, you can advance these kinds of ideas. But I think that's a really, really good question, and I think it's really important for us as educators to dispense with this, culture, this idea of, well, it's the teacher's problem, and make sure that we are providing. Yeah, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but we should be providing the leadership, the structures, the systems, and the conditions of work that enable, excellence in teaching. As far as student voice goes, I would, ask a lot of questions. I mean, I think we just had a bunch of student listening sessions recently, for example, that gave us some really interesting ideas that we don't necessarily get when we go up through the chain in individual programs. So I think this idea of creating opportunities for student voice is something we will never get right. We just have to keep doing it and working at it. So Melissa, back to you. I think we need to do breakout groups, right?
Yeah, we'd like to just give you a few minutes. There's so many ideas here, and I'm sure you all have really great ideas too. So we are going to do breakout rooms. How many minutes were our breakout rooms, or would you like to do?
You
What do you
originally
think,
had
Bob?
said 12, but I'm thinking you want to go a little less. Do you want to do 8 minutes?
Yeah, let's do 8 minutes. So I don't know if Punya can put in the link. We want you to kind of discuss these questions, and we have a link where you can see those questions because the screen goes away once you leave the main session. But just take some time, talk amongst your groups, and then we'll come back and perhaps have a way you can share out some of those observations. So we can go ahead and open those breakout rooms now. So as everyone's getting back, yeah, we didn't have tons of time, but if you have any notes or thoughts to add to that Google Doc, that would be a great resource, I think, for everyone to hear back, what happened in these breakout rooms and pull together with what happens across all of these webinars across time, so we can start gathering more information and working as a community to address these issues. Arlene, was someone else going to finish these last wrap-up slides, or would you like me to?
I think that's back to Dennis, if you're ready to close down. And, I'll just say we had some interesting conversation about gaps. And yeah, I think that might be a place where people can really add to the Google Doc gaps they're facing.
Arlene, it started to give you the outline for your next book.
Yeah, it looks like we're about out of time, so I'm going to start to wrap things up here. First of all, everybody, on behalf of the authors and the Teacher Education Network, I want to thank you for participating in today's webinar. We've all been provided with a lot to think about today and the big picture to explore with each other. This is just the next step of a really exciting and engaging process that's about building community. I said this last week. Make connections with people that you've met here. Work collaboratively with those people, ask questions, create a plan of action for your teacher preparation program. So Lori has a couple of important reminders to share with you. I want to thank you again. We'll see you at webinar 3 on higher education competencies, April 7th. Lori, it's all yours to close things out.
Thanks, Dennis. You'll notice that there's 2 hashtags at the bottom of that screen there. Please use them if you do tweet out. And if you're interested, ISTE10 actually is running a Twitter chat tonight on gaming. So if you're interested in joining that conversation, you're welcome to join us at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you can go to that next slide there, Melissa. Again, here's the information if you need to contact any of the presenters today. There's so much that happened in this past hour, so if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to them. And I believe, is there one more? Yes, all right. And then on this last slide here, we'll put those links in the chat for you. Please sign up for future championing webinars. We'd love to have you to continue the conversation as we go through this book. And the final one is going to be a culminating event at ISTE 21 Live. So if you're participating in ISTE this year, and we hope that you are, we'll be able to continue this conversation and celebrate everything that we've learned in this book at that conference. So thank you all for coming.